Good afternoon, everyone. The Cholangiocarcinoma Foundation would like to welcome you to our webinar on clinical trials. As luck would have it, Dr. Goyal is running just a few minutes behind, so we're going to just take care of a little business while we're waiting for her. First thing today, we're going to do a couple live polls, so we'd appreciate your participation in all of those. And then afterwards, we're going to have a follow-up survey, and we'd appreciate your participation in that as well, so that we can provide you with the needs that you guys want. We take your feedback seriously, and we appreciate you guys when you fill out that information for us. Also, thank you to everyone who pre-submitted questions for the webinar today. We'll get through all the ones that were submitted. And if time allows, at the end of the hour, we will go ahead and have you, if you have any further questions, you can raise your hand and Rick can unmute you and you can ask yourself, or if you'd like to, you can submit a question in the chat box. Our schedule moving forward is going to continue to be the patient support group on the first Thursday of the month and the caregiver support group on the third Thursday of the month. And then we'll continue to have educational webinars on the second and fourth Thursdays of the month. Also, I want to remind everyone about the annual conference, our virtual conference coming up July 22nd through the 24th. The first 500 patients and caregivers registered will receive a conference box that will be full of information and goodies. So if you haven't registered yet, please go ahead and register. I think Rick could maybe put up the link. If not, it's on our website. And also, I think we're going to go ahead and start off with a poll, some of our poll questions. We'll get those taken care of, and hopefully by the time that's done, Dr. Goyal will be on. So, and we're going to do these polls now, and then we're going to repeat them after Dr. Goyal's presentation and kind of see if you guys have learned anything. So, poll question number 1, go ahead and take them. Has your doctor talked to you about clinical trials? And number 2, have you had tumor mutational profiling, tumor sequencing, genetic sequencing, biomarker testing, genomic testing? All of them pretty much mean the same thing done. Yes, no, or unsure. 3, do you know the difference between phase 1, 2, and 3 clinical trials? And number 4 is, do you know the difference between a cholangio-specific trial and a basket trial? And number 5, would you join a phase 1 clinical trial? And number 6, would you join a first-in-human study, a study where a drug is going into a human for the first time? Yes, no, or unsure. We'll give you guys some time to answer those questions. Yay! Dr. Goyal made it.
Melinda.
Hi. So glad you're here. We just did a little bit of housekeeping and had them do the first set of poll questions so we can see the answers shortly. But first of all, let me do your introduction.
Oh, thank you. Sorry I was late. I was just finishing another webinar.
No.
This is the world of virtual.
We know you're in high demand. We're just grateful you're here.
No. This is just COVID.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so everyone, Dr. Lipika Goyal is from Boston, Mass General. She's been very involved with the Cholangiocarcinoma Foundation. She has served on our medical advisory board. She also chairs one of the working groups for the International Cholangiocarcinoma Research Network. She treats many of our cholangiocarcinoma patients and is considered an expert in the field, and we're so pleased to have her with us today.
Thank you. It's really my honor and my pleasure, Melinda, to be here.
Thank you. Rick, do you want to see results? How are we doing there?
We're about 80%. I'm going to give it like 5 more seconds. So if you haven't answered, you have 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, let me share the results.
All right, so has your doctor talked to you about a clinical trial? So we have 72% said yes, 22% said no, and 6% were unsure. Have you had tumor mutational profiling or biomarker testing and all the other definitions for it? 81% said yes, 16% said no, and only 3% were unsure. So that's good. I'm glad to hear that. Do you know the difference between phase 1, 2, and 3 clinical trials? Looks like it's 50-50 there. And 4, do you know the difference between a cholangiospecific trial and a basket trial? 38% said yes, and 63% said no. And would you join a phase 1 clinical trial? 44% said yes, 3% no, and 53% are unsure. And would you join a first-in-human study, a study where a drug is going into a human for the first time? 31% said yes, 6% no, and 63% unsure. So that might give you some ideas of what you can touch on.
Yeah, this is very helpful.
Okay, I will kick it over to you and holler if you need anything.
Yeah. So thank you everyone for having me today, and thank you for your interest in attending this. I think clinical trials are a really critical thing to think about right now as patients and caregivers for people that love patients who have cholangiocarcinoma. So first of all, what is a clinical trial? That's one of the questions that we got. The way I think about clinical trials is they're a shot at a miracle, but they also have a risk of having side effects, these drugs. And so anytime you go on a new drug, you have a shot of your tumor being exquisitely sensitive to that drug and someone having a really great response and then getting a lot of benefit from that drug. And right now, we're learning how to figure out to match patients with clinical trials so that you have a higher chance of being that person with a really good response. That's what biomarkers are, or that's what mutation testing is about. It's trying to understand and interrogate your tumor to figure out what is the switch in your tumor that's making it grow, so we can figure out a drug that can maybe turn that switch off. But also, clinical trials are research studies. So they're not drugs that are approved by the FDA for this specific indication. And so you are taking a chance. Now, there are some clinical trials where it's a drug that's being repurposed. So it's a drug that might be approved in colon cancer or breast cancer or prostate cancer. And we have a scientific hunch that it might also work in patients with cholangiocarcinoma. An example of that is nivolumab. Nivolumab is approved in many cancers, and then it was tried in cholangiocarcinoma. And it had an 11% response, which is a chance of having 30% shrinkage or more when you just used it alone. There are two different ways that we assess response on a clinical trial. One is your doctor can take a look at it, so the investigator assesses it. And the other is that you send the scans over to the company and it's done centrally. Now, we as oncologists, we're very positive people, and so the investigator or the doctor assessment, that number always comes out higher than when you send it to the company and there's like an unbiased person who doesn't know the patient. So in the nivolumab trial with the doctor assessment, it was around 22%, a little over 20%, and with the central assessment, it was 11%. But, that's with nivolumab, for example, a drug that's being repurposed for seeing if it works in cholangio. Same thing with the pembrolizumab trial. Same thing with different kinds of chemo trials, like the FOLFOX trial that just came out from the group in the UK with Angela Lamarca. We're using drugs that work in other diseases and we're seeing, okay, does it work in our patients too? Then there are other drugs that have not been approved by the FDA for any cancer, but we have a good scientific hunch that it's going to work for whatever reason in patients with cholangiocarcinoma. And so we try it in that way, and we do what's called a cholangiocarcinoma specific trial. So it could be something that's directed at a target, or it could be something that is in patients who don't specifically have a biomarker. And that would be an option where it's a drug that is either being tried in many different cancers, or it's a drug that's being tried as a first in human. So I'll give you an example of that. There's a drug called pemigatinib. You might have heard about it. It's the drug that just got FDA approval. It's the first drug to have FDA approval in cholangiocarcinoma. That drug is an FGFR inhibitor. That drug, we tried it in patients who don't have cholangiocarcinoma, and that was more of a basket trial. And then we tried it in patients who do have cholangiocarcinoma. And so there are different trials that are more specific to patients with this particular cancer, and there are trials that are more broad to all different kinds of patients with cancer.
So since you just mentioned basket trial, will you give just a little definition on that?
Yeah. So there are different kinds of basket trials. So for example, let me tell you a little bit about mutational profiling. I was so happy to see that 80% of people are having mutational profiling, because I think just 5 years ago, that was probably around 20 to 30%. And there are a lot more people in the unsure category because people didn't know what mutational profiling is. So I think with all the education that all our patient advocates are doing, that the Cholangiocarcinoma Foundation is doing, that the Mutations Matter campaign is doing, that all the oncologists are also starting to learn more about personalized medicine. Now that we have a drug that's approved, I think there's going to be more mutational profiling. So I'm just so happy to see that people are aware of it and are getting it done. But how do I think about that? So DNA is basically instructions of life, and all of our cells have DNA. And tumor cells also have DNA. And sometimes there's spelling mistakes in those instructions. And those spelling mistakes are mutations, basically. They're mutations in the DNA. And so we can send your tumor tissue, the biopsy tissue that you had, over to the lab. It can either be at your institution or it can be at a commercial institution. And we can look at the DNA and see if you have any mutations. And there are different kinds of mutations. There are fusions, there are mutations, there are amplifications. That's all in DNA. We can also look at the protein level and see if you have high protein expression of certain markers. We can look at the RNA level and see if there's high expression of certain things. So there are lots of different ways to get to know your tumor better. And it's so important that everybody who's interested in clinical trials, interested in Plan B options, you go and you get your tumor profiled and you see what do we know about your tumor and what kind of drugs we can match for you. And so what is a basket trial? There are certain mutations that we see in patients with cholangiocarcinoma. One example is the BRAF V600E mutation. And BRAF V600E mutations are seen in about 5% of patients with cholangiocarcinoma. They're also seen in patients with colon cancer and melanoma and thyroid cancer and many other cancers. Now, it's really hard to run a trial when there's such a small population of patients with it. So what companies sometimes do is they run basket trials, and they'll have multiple different baskets or cohorts. So they'll have 10 different baskets, the thyroid basket, the cholangio basket, the XYZ basket. And then that is the way they enroll, and then you can get access to drugs that way. So they're common targets, which sometimes have their own trial. I'm sure many of you have heard about FGFR fusions, IDH1 mutations, patients who have MSI high tumors, microsatellite instability. These are more, well, FGFR and IDH are common. MSI high is around 2%. But these are trials that, sometimes there's a specific trial for cholangiocarcinoma for FGFR and IDH. But when it's rare, like MSI high or BRAF V600E, then we're more likely to do that in the context of basket trials.
Thank you. That makes sense. So do you want me to continue down on and ask some more questions?
Yes, I was just thinking about the first in human trial and phase 1 trials and phase 1, 2, and 3. Maybe I'll just go over that briefly because I think there were some questions about that.
Yes.
So let me start by saying that every single drug that gets approved by the FDA has to start with a phase 1 trial. And most drugs will progress from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3 and then get FDA approval. But right now, what we're seeing with these biomarker-driven trials where we're able to identify a mutation and then match a patient with a drug, and we're seeing people have high response rates, the FDA is like, yes, we understand patients need to have access to these drugs. We cannot wait for the whole phase 3 trial to be done because that's going to take years. So we will give what's called accelerated FDA approval at the phase 2 level, sometimes even at the phase 1 level if the data is amazing enough. And then patients can have access to that drug, and then the companies have to go on to do a phase 3 trial to prove that, yes, what we were seeing in the phase 2 trial is indeed true. So what is a phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 trial? The phase 1 trial is usually where we're trying to figure out what is the right dose of the drug and what is the safety of the drug. So sometimes that's because that drug has never been in human beings before, and we got to figure out what the right dose is. That's called a first in human trial. Sometimes the drug is approved in colon cancer, but maybe patients with cholangiocarcinoma might tolerate it differently. So we might start at a lower dose than the dose used in colon cancer. But they do different doses, and then they figure out what is the maximum tolerated dose. And they'll often drop one dose, and that will be the dose they move on for the phase 2 or for the expansion. So safety and dose finding is phase 1. And then phase 2 is when you're looking for preliminary efficacy. So in cholangiocarcinoma, a lot of the phase 2 trials, there's sometimes 30 patients, sometimes 50 patients, sometimes about 100 patients. And you look for a preliminary signal of efficacy. And as I mentioned, sometimes you go on to get approval based on a phase 2, but sometimes you just get a signal and you're like, okay, I think this drug has promise, and then you move on to a phase 3 trial. A phase 3 trial, vast majority of the time, is a randomized trial where you have the experimental drug compared to whatever the standard of care is. So a couple of examples right now that are going on. The first phase 3 trial done by the cooperative groups in cholangiocarcinoma in the United States is being run by Dr. Rachna Shroff from the University of Arizona. And that is the GAP trial at SWOG 1815. And that is, it's a randomized phase 3 trial, and patients are either getting gemcitabine and cisplatin, or they're getting gemcitabine, cisplatin, and nab-paclitaxel. And we don't decide as doctors, you don't decide as patients, it's a computer that decides. And then you're assigned one arm or the other, because we don't want there to be bias, and we don't know which regimen is better. So there has to be what's called equipoise, which means we can't randomize patients to one side or the other if we think that one is definitely better, because that's not ethical, you know? So in a randomized trial, there's always equipoise, or we don't know which side is better, okay? So that's one phase 3 trial that's going on. Another set of phase 3 trials that are going on are gemcitabine cisplatin versus gemcitabine cisplatin plus your favorite immunotherapy drug. So there are a variety of different trials: pembrolizumab, nivolumab, durvalumab. That's another set of trials that are phase 3. There's another set of trials that is from the ABC08 data. So that was data from the UK, and that's a gemcitabine analog. So some patients develop resistance to gemcitabine. So this is like a fancy gemcitabine, basically. So half the patients get gemcitabine cisplatin, half the patients get gemcitabine and cisplatin. Sometimes they're biomarker driven. So there are also trials going on right now for patients with FGFR2 fusions. I'm sorry I keep mentioning that, just there's a lot of trials going on right now for that, which is that when you first get diagnosed, you go ahead and get mutational profiling very quickly. And if you're in the 10 to 15% of patients who have an FGFR2 fusion, you can be randomized to either getting gemcitabine and cisplatin or getting randomized to an FGFR inhibitor. And the benefit of that is you get to spare yourself chemo in the first line, because right now pemigatinib is only approved in the second line. And so this is a chance to see if the FGFR inhibitors are better than gemcitabine and cisplatin. So all of our patients who have FGFR2 fusions can spare chemo and go onto this drug. So there's also placebo-controlled trials, and that's a question I often get in clinic. Doc, am I going to get a placebo, or am I going to get the real thing? So majority of the time for phase 1 trials, there's no placebo. I don't think I've ever seen a phase 1 trial that has a placebo. Everybody gets the drug. Sometimes people get a low dose of the drug, because sometimes we start at 1/10 of the dose and then go up incrementally just to make sure it's safe, but everybody gets the drug. In phase 2 studies, sometimes they're randomized, and they can be randomized against placebo or another regimen, just depends on the trial. Some of you may be familiar with the CLARITY study, which was for patients with cholangiocarcinoma who have an IDH1 mutation. That was a 2-to-1 randomization, which means that 2 patients for every 1 patient were given the IDH inhibitor, and 1 patient was given the placebo. And that's because at that time, there was no standard for what people could get in the second line. So I know the Cholangiocarcinoma Foundation, I know Melinda was very vocal, and when we were designing that trial, we totally understand and respect how stressful placebo the chance of being randomized to a placebo arm is. And so we rarely do placebo-controlled trials, to be honest. And the truth is, now that we're getting more options for patients, I think there'll be fewer placebo-controlled trials, because the standard, for example, now would often randomize against FOLFOX, for example, in the second line. And so some people say, you know, doc, I kind of want to go with what's tried and true. And I know that these other drugs have been given to a lot of patients. I'd rather go on drugs that we have a lot of a track record for. And I totally respect that and understand that. And then there are other patients who say, you know what, doc, these drugs that you want to give me and these statistics that you're telling me, they don't really sound that good. I don't want to go with the old stuff. What do you got for me that's new, you know? And so that's where you can go onto clinical trials and get access to drugs that are not yet FDA approved. One of the challenges with clinical trials is, and you know, now with coronavirus, there's one of the silver linings is there is a lot of telemedicine now. And so one of the things Melinda and I were talking about was how can we open up clinical trials to people who live far away from institutions. One of the best ways to access clinical trials is to first go onto clinicaltrials.gov and to type in cholangiocarcinoma, see what trials are around, and then see which ones are near you. And I know that Melinda advises so many patients about how to find clinical trials, so I'll also ask her about how she helps patients on that front. But for clinical trials, they sometimes require initially a lot of visits. They often space out afterwards, but really want to make sure you're safe. And so to get onto the trial, there are a couple of hoops that we all need to jump through, which are making sure your kidneys are okay, your heart's okay, your lungs are okay. They do EKGs, urine tests, make sure you're not pregnant, all that kind of stuff before you start. And as long as it seems like you're safe to start, then you go on to the trial. And then usually for the first month, you're closely monitored. Again, it's a new drug to you. Sometimes it's a new drug in humans, so we watch you very closely. But usually after the first month, most trials, they loosen up in terms of the number of visits. But people can access them by going to any of the medical centers near you and sort of asking your oncologist. It's always good to ask your oncologist, what clinical trials do you have? Who can you refer me to offer clinical trials if we don't have any here in this practice? But Melinda, maybe you can share a little bit about what you advise patients, because you definitely help people link up with clinical trials.
Yeah, absolutely. Clinicaltrials.gov isn't always the easiest website to navigate, so I'm always happy to help patients look for clinical trials. We also have some clinical trials listed on our website that might be a little easier to look through. It's in different categories. One of the things that I was going to ask you to touch on as you were talking were first-line treatments. When you're talking about phase 3, most of those seems to be first-line clinical trials where they would have to enter into that first before starting any treatment, and what you feel about that. And then crossover options, like with the placebo arm, if that's possible.
Yeah, great question. So whenever you have a frontline phase 3 trial, pretty much everyone is getting gemcitabine and cisplatin. There are some other phase 3s that might be designed a little bit differently, but the idea is that everybody gets a standard of care. And then also in the experimental arm, for the vast majority of those trials, they're gemcitabine cisplatin plus, because the question is, are 3 drugs better than 2? And sometimes it's, are 4 drugs better than 2, And so you could potentially be buying more efficacy. You could be buying like it working better, but you could just be buying more side effects without actually getting any benefit. And so there are multiple phase 3 trials across oncology that end up being negative, where you could try to beat the standard of care and have a new standard of care for that cancer. But then in the end, whatever you're trying is just not better than what's already out there. So you always take that chance when you go on a clinical trial that you might be getting 3 drugs instead of 2, and we might be thinking 3 are better than 2. But in the end, if you look at the entire trial, it may not be positive. But the important point also is sometimes trials are negative as a whole. So when you look at 500 patients, arm A did not beat arm B, but there are many individual success stories within each trial, so there are many people that got benefit. But the way we figure out is a trial positive or not is we look at how long people lived on one trial, on one arm, and how long people lived on the other arm for a phase 3 trial. Generally speaking, the primary endpoint most of the time is overall survival. And then we look at the median. So the median survival for patients. So if you have 100 patients, the 50th patient on the experimental arm and the 50th patient on the control arm, and you see how long did that person live. And you compare the 50th patient on both arms and you see if one beat the other. And it's based on statistics, and you have to improve not just by a day or a week, you have to improve by whatever was statistically set out from the beginning, often 2 months or 3 months or something like that. And so I think frontline trials are great because gemcitabine and cisplatin has been out since ASCO 2009. It's a regimen that works, but as we all know, it has side effects. And for some patients, it doesn't work. And for some patients, it works, but just for a little bit of time. So all of us are really hungry for something that's going to be better than gemcitabine and cisplatin, both in terms of how well people tolerate it, but then also how well it works. So I often tell this story, but something I remember from one of the Cholangiocarcinoma Foundation conferences was a woman coming up to the microphone and saying, hey, I have this mutation, but I live here and I don't live near UCSF and MGH and Mayo and MD Anderson. So how do I get access to the drug? And so by doing clinical trials, that's how these drugs get approved, and then everybody all over the country gets access. So it's a lot easier for people to be able to then go to their local oncologist, get the drug, instead of having, I'm seeing a patient tomorrow who was flying from New York to MD Anderson back and forth for a trial. And that's amazing how much tenacity and commitment and will and sacrifice everybody in the community has. It's amazing. And then she's going to come see me up at Mass General, and we're going to talk about what trial options we have, But, if whatever I could offer was approved, then she could stay in New York and she could get her drug, So right. My hope always is to offer people clinical trials. I recognize they're not for everybody, and your oncologist can definitely guide you on what might be a good trial for you,
Yeah. So one thing that I guess is a pet peeve of mine as a patient is when patients don't get offered the opportunity to participate in a clinical trial, especially for all these first-line therapies that are out there. And I guess as a patient, I view it as we're all going to get gemcitabine cisplatin anyway, so it would be a great opportunity for patients to participate in moving the science forward for ourselves and for other patients to be able to enroll in those first-line clinical trials. So if we can get...
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think there are a couple of things. I think one, because cholangiocarcinoma is an uncommon tumor, the phase 3 trials are not like the breast cancer trials, the colon cancer trials, and the prostate cancer trials, where they're being run at many, many different centers in many, many different states. And oncologists have a lot of patients with breast cancer, unfortunately, and so they know that these are trials. I think a lot of oncologists just don't know about the trials. And so that's why I'm so glad everyone is attending today, and you're taking your care in your hands, and you're advocating for yourself or for your loved ones, that you're all calling Melinda and asking her, what can I do? Because certainly as oncologists, if people bring us ideas, that makes us really happy. We want to give you ideas, of course, but if you think of something, if you hear of something that we don't know about, if you hear about a trial that we haven't heard about, by all means, you bring it to your appointment and we talk about it, and then we'll help you decide if it's a good match for you.
Absolutely. And then if you just touch a little bit on the crossover options or what that means.
Right. So when you have a biomarker, when you have a mutation on your tumor, sometimes we do a personalized medicine approach to helping you fight the cancer. And that is a biomarker-driven trial where we give you a targeted therapy or an immunotherapy that's specifically against that target. So for example, the CLARITY study that I discussed, where our patients who had IDH1 mutant tumors got the IDH1 inhibitor evositinib in a 2-to-1 randomization against placebo. The only reason that trial, one of the ways that trial was palatable, because, of course, being on a placebo when you have a mutation doesn't feel good, was that the Cholangiocarcinoma Foundation, the patients, and the company itself advocated with the FDA to say, we can't just leave these patients on placebo and not give them the option to cross over and go onto the experimental drug. We have to let them be able to get the drug and give it to them. And so the scan was at 6 weeks, so it was an early time point. Normally we do scans somewhere between 6 and 9 weeks for the first time point. Scans were at 6 weeks, and then anyone who had progression on their scans, they had the option of being unblinded to figure out if they were on the IDH1 inhibitor arm or the placebo arm. And if you were on the placebo arm, you had the option of crossing over to go onto the IDH1 inhibitor. When you do that, the primary endpoint for the study is progression-free survival as opposed to overall survival. That makes it a little bit challenging to convince the FDA to then approve the drug, because generally speaking, the bar for FDA approval is overall survival benefit. People have to live longer. We can't just delay the time to when their cancer starts to grow again. They need to live longer for the drug to be approved. So crossover studies, we give access to those patients who are on the trial, but then sometimes long-term, it impacts the ability to get it approved. But still, at the end of the day, I believe that you can't have people be randomized to a placebo when you have a potentially great drug and not let them have crossover. So I think it behooves us as oncologists to be able to advocate with the FDA, think about creative trial designs to allow people to get access, because every patient, of course, matters, and we need to give everybody the best shot.
Yeah, totally think it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, definitely. Me too.
All right. Do you want to go on to some other questions?
Sure. There's one more thing I wanted to say about just the difference between the three different types of therapy. I think anyone who's logging into this is probably pretty savvy, but I'll just mention it once, that there's chemotherapy, there's targeted therapy, and there's immunotherapy. And sometimes people are unsure what the difference is. And chemotherapy is like gemcitabine, cisplatin, and FOLFOX. They're often drugs that, for example, damage DNA or somehow target the cancer cells in a way that is not necessarily specific to any particular mutation or biomarker. Chemotherapy is what works right now in cholangiocarcinoma. We're working on other drugs, but we also know that while it kills cancer cells, it kills good cells, and people can have nausea because of, inflammation of their stomach or their intestines. They can lose their hair. They can get neuropathy because of the impact on their fingers and toes, on the nerves in their fingers and toes. So chemotherapy is kind of a blunt instrument. It works, but it has problems, okay? Then there's targeted therapy. Targeted therapy is, as I was saying, finding those spelling mistakes, finding those mutations on tumor mutational profiling, and then going ahead and trying to give a drug to shut off the signaling. It's the same thing. It targets cancer cells, but it also has problems in that sometimes whatever that target is not only in the cancer cells. So for example, EGFR mutations are something that we target in lung cancer. EGFR inhibitors work great in terms of killing cancer cells that have EGFR mutations, but we also have EGFR in our skin. So people get rashes when you give EGFR inhibitors. So there's like that collateral damage sometimes with targeted therapy. And then there's immunotherapy, just which works in a very different way. So immunotherapy doesn't directly target cancer cells. Immunotherapy basically boosts your immune system to be able to recognize and kill your cancer, because cancer is foreign, right? We weren't born with cancer. It's foreign, so our immune system should be able to recognize it and kill it. But one of my patients told me this analogy. He's like, Dr. Goyal, it's like the cancer has an invisibility cloak like Harry Potter, and the cancers like put a cloak on top of themselves, on their cells. So when the immune system walks by, and the soldiers of the immune system are the T cells, when the T cells walk by, they don't recognize that there's cancer lurking behind the corner, and they just kind of walk by. And so these drugs, these PD-L1, PD-1 inhibitors, what they do at some level is they uncloak the cancer and allow the immune cells to be able to recognize and kill the cancer. And there are all sorts of different immunotherapy options. But because they don't directly target cancer cells, they have a different set of side effects, which is that the immunotherapy, while it boosts your immune system, the immune system can get confused. And instead of going against your cancer cells, it can actually attack yourself, and you can have some autoimmune type symptoms. Now, the good news is we know how to treat it. We've seen it. We can give steroids to calm down the immune system. We can give other medications to calm down the immune system. It can be a little bit scary when it happens. It means that sometimes people go into the hospital because they have bad inflammation of their colon or their lungs or their liver or even sometimes their heart or their brain. It can be a little scary. But if you're at a center that gives immunotherapy, then you're at a center that knows how to take care of patients who have side effects from from immunotherapy. And so we have lots of ways to help people feel better on immunotherapy and then get them through to even re-challenge and have them go on the immunotherapy again. And so I think that one of the things with immunotherapy is that it's also a chance at a home run. Those home runs, unfortunately, are not as frequent as we want them to be. They're in the single digit percentages, but right now the big thing in clinical trials is what can we combine with immunotherapy to make it work better? Because immunotherapy has sort of like a 5 to 15% response rate in the setting of just using that drug alone, like nivolumab alone, pembrolizumab alone. But we're thinking, what if we can use a drug, combine it with immunotherapy, and again, uncloak the cancer so the immunotherapy can work better? So all sorts of combination immunotherapy trials. These are great if there isn't a specific mutation on your cancer, because oftentimes the immunotherapy trials are not biomarker selected. And that could be immunotherapy plus another immunotherapy, immunotherapy plus chemotherapy, immunotherapy plus targeted therapy, or it could be immunotherapy plus some sort of local therapy like radiation or Y90 or chemoembolization, any of these local therapies. So lots of combination, lots of trials. I have to say, when I started studying cholangiocarcinoma more than 10 years ago, we would go with our hand out to pharmaceutical companies saying, can we please have this drug that you're using in pancreas cancer? Can we please do a trial of 30 patients with cholangiocarcinoma? And now, I mean, Melinda can speak to this, like at the Cholangiocarcinoma Foundation meeting, there are just so many companies that are coming to us as investigators and they say, we want to help your patients. We want to try our drug in your patients and offer it to your patients. How can we get access to be running a trial in your network? And so I think this is hugely because of the advocacy of all the people on this call are doing right now and all the visibility that you're giving to the cholangiocarcinoma cause. And then, of course, to everything the foundation, Melinda and Stacy and everybody do all the time.
Yeah, it's super exciting. Question back on immunotherapy trials. So people with autoimmune histories, PSC, colitis, those different things, does that always exclude them from using immunotherapy?
It's a good question. I would say there's some trials that say if you have any autoimmune disorder, then you can't go on the trial. I think what we've learned over time is that there are a lot of patients who can safely get treated. So what I've seen more lately is that the eligibility criteria will often say, if your Crohn's disease has been quiet for 2 years, then you can go ahead and go on this trial. And so, we always hope for that being the eligibility criteria that, of course, we don't want to give immunotherapy in the middle of someone having a Crohn's flare or having a flare of the rheumatoid arthritis. But if it's been quiet for a while, it's a life-saving therapy potentially. So we want to be able to offer it to people. So yes, we do try to consider it for patients who have autoimmune diseases.
Good. So I just want patients out there to know to always ask, no matter what.
Yes, definitely. And, sometimes as an oncologist, we might make an assumption about a trial, but now that the eligibility criteria are becoming more liberal, it's definitely worth putting your eyeballs on that eligibility checklist and really being sure that that patients are or not excluded.
Yeah. And I would always ask anyway, even if it's on that exclusion criteria, I would always ask, always double check.
Yes. Because sometimes we can talk to the company. I mean, eligibility criteria are often relatively strict, but sometimes there's little ways to be creative to meet the eligibility criteria in a creative way. And so, you can definitely work with your oncologist to figure out ways that finding trials that work.
And we're working on that too, because I just always feel like, patients are not a number. We don't always fall within that range, and we all have to be looked at individually as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay. Let's see. Do you have anything else you want to touch on, or should I go through some of these questions? I think we've touched on a lot, but I'll see what we have here.
One question that came over the listserv this morning was, how do you figure out if a drug is working or not on a clinical trial? Does your doctor just say it's working and I want to keep you on it, or the doctor says, no, it's not working, we take you off? There's some very strict criteria because of this exact question about how do we compare across trials and across patients if a drug is working or not. So what we do is we do a baseline scan and take an assessment of your tumor. Then we do another scan at 6 weeks, 8 weeks, whenever the first scan is, and we compare. And we use something called RECIST criteria, which is looking at 2 cancer nodules per organ for up to 5 organs. So these are what we call the measurable lesions and the target lesions. And we can have 2 in the liver, 2 in the lung, 2 someplace else, or you could just have 1. You could have 1 spot in the liver, and that's what we use. And then once we've already decided what the target lesions are, every single time you have a scan, we measure those target lesions. And you take the sum of the diameter of the target lesions. And let's say that adds up to 5 centimeters to begin with. On your next scan, we see what does it add up to. Hopefully it's going to add up to 1 centimeter or no centimeters, And so we compare what your baseline amount of tumor burden is with your next scan. And we see, did you have more than 30% tumor shrinkage? That's called a partial response. Did you have complete tumor shrinkage where we can't see anything? That's called a complete response. Or did you have stable disease, which is when you add up the diameter of those target lesions, it's somewhere between minus 30% and plus 20%. So you have a little bit of wiggle room. Even if the tumor grows a little bit, but it's under 20% growth, you still stay on the trial. If it's above 20% growth, that's considered progressive disease. Or if there's a new lesion that pops up, that's thought to escape the benefit of the drug. And so any new lesion or growth more than 20%, that's considered progressive disease. And that's when we feel the drug is not working. Like no one's trying to kick someone off a trial, you know what I mean? If we think something is working, we often try to continue drugs post-progression. And there are a lot of pharmaceutical companies that are very patient-centric. I always look for that in protocols when I accept trials at Mass General. I say, okay, is this allowing drug post-progression? Because sometimes, everything is well controlled, but there's one spot that starts to grow. Okay, so we'll offer radiation to that spot. We'll offer ablation to that spot. And then maybe we can keep on going on the drug to control the rest of the tumor. I've done that for a number of patients over the years. And so I'm really glad that a lot of companies allow us to do that. So just because you have progression on a scan, it doesn't mean that you're necessarily off the trial. And then sometimes your doctor might say, well, you're quote unquote officially off the trial because you have progression, but we can keep giving you the drug. Honestly, that doesn't make a difference in your life at all. As long as you're getting the drug, it doesn't matter if you're off the trial or not, so never feel badly about that. As long as you're getting the drug, it's the same for your life. It's just, it affects the statistics for the trial because they stop counting a person once they have progression in terms of how long they're living or how long they're benefiting. But as long as you're getting the drug, it doesn't mean if you're off the trial. And I understand a lot of patients feel very disappointed when they're taken off the trial, but I always feel like, oh, but they're letting us keep the drug and keep it going. So that's a good thing.
Right. So that was a good plug for the videos that we just shared, I think, last week on the results of clinical trials. So maybe Rick could put that link in the chat for everyone on too. We did videos with Insight and Target Cancer Foundation that describe the RECIST criteria, stable disease. So they're really, really helpful. Okay. What next? Let's see. I'm going to start. Can someone start a brand new clinical trial during the coronavirus pandemic?
That's a great question. It is very institution specific. Different institutions are opening up at different rates. And so some institutions are allowing a 15% increase in accrual per month. Some institutions are saying, okay, each leader of the group, pick 5 trials that you're going to allow patients on. And then when coronavirus settles down a little bit, we will open up more trials. And then there's some cancer centers that are just open and all trials are enrolling. So it's definitely worth talking to your institution to see if trials are enrolling. But companies have been fantastic during coronavirus. I'll be honest, like we do a lot of remote consents. We do a lot of remote visits. People go to a lab near their house, they get their labs, then I do a video call with them. It's especially true for anyone who's on oral drugs because we mail them the drug, they get their labs locally, and then we do a video chat. And it's a little hard if someone is having like a major rash on their hands or a major mouth sores or something like that. And sometimes we do ask people to come in for their safety, but there are a lot of people that are doing great and they just either come in for their IV drug or we do a lot of stuff over the phone.
Awesome. Now, I think you touched on this a little bit too, but at what point do you consider a clinical trial? So, I mean, I know for me as a patient, I tell people to consider it immediately. I mean, for cholangiocarcinoma, that's an integrative part of our treatment plan is clinical trials. So I guess as physicians, do you always look at it right away?
I agree with you wholeheartedly. If I have a first-line trial for someone, then if I have a trial for someone who had surgery and there's a trial like, do you get chemo or not? I mean, now capecitabine is pretty much the standard. And some people use gemcitabine and capecitabine together. So I don't think there'll be trials that are randomized against placebo. But if there's an adjuvant trial, like at any point in someone's care, if there's a trial, I always I always offer it, but at least we can have a conversation about it. And sometimes it takes a little bit of time to warm up to the idea of a trial. Sometimes when you're first diagnosed, you're like, no, I want to just go with what's out there that other people are using. I know it works. I'd rather do that than go on to something that I'm not sure how I'm going to feel on it. And that's totally fine. But yeah, I think from the very first time you're putting any drop of chemo into your body, I think it's worth asking, do you have any clinical trials for me?
I agree. So many patients' results come back with no matches. I think they're talking about with the profiling. And so what is recommended for them to navigate trials?
Yeah, there are lots of novel drugs that don't depend on people having mutations. We know that like probably around 50 to 60% of patients with intrahepatic cholangiocarcinoma and a larger percent of patients with extrahepatic cholangiocarcinoma don't have a specific spelling mistake that we can go after. And that's okay because we have other trials. We have immunotherapy trials. We have, for example, this gemcitabine analog, that doesn't require a biomarker. Any of the GemCis plus immunotherapy, that doesn't require a biomarker. A lot of the trials do not require biomarkers. Same thing with some of the phase 1 trials. Some of the phase 1 trials are biomarker selected, but some of them are not. So it's always worth asking. And now with virtual visits, you can certainly get consults at other places that are a little bit further away. You know, everyone's doing virtual visits. So I think you can find out what trials are available.
I agree. So another good question on that is, when a patient qualifies for more than one clinical trial, what is the best way to determine which trial is the better match? Like, which order do we go in?
You know, I tell you, I struggle with that sometimes. One, I'm euphoric when I have 2 options for a patient or 3 options for a patient, and I can say, okay, let's sit down. We have multiple different options and you qualify for all of them. Which one should we pick? So I think it's great when people have that kind of situation. And I would say it's a shared decision-making with your oncologist. And you say, doc, what are the side effects of the drug? What is the track record of the drug? Do we know anything about how well this drug might potentially work in someone like me? And then it also depends on factors in your life. Is it important to be on an oral drug, or is it okay to have an IV drug? Do you have a way of getting back and forth to the hospital? You know, there are some trials require you to be hospitalized overnight on the day that you get the drug so you can be observed. You know, hopefully we can make most of our decisions based on how well the drug is going to work and the side effects. But sometimes we know that, you know, life is real and logistics matter. And so, you know, understanding the logistics, how often you have to come in, all that kind of stuff really matters.
Yeah, okay. There were a couple questions submitted. What about clinical trials in Europe? Do you have any experience with that?
Yeah, it's a good question. Melinda, you might know, is there a clinicaltrials.gov equivalent in Europe?
No, but you can search clinicaltrials.gov and put in the country and it'll, you know, populate with all the trials that are available there. I mean, I use that for all the international patients because I'm not sure where else to search other than also for Europe. The foundation AMMF is a big resource over there.
That sounds great. Yeah, that's absolutely true.
Okay. And if having a biopsy is potentially too painful, difficult for a patient to endure, would you still recommend the blood-based genetic profiling? So maybe touch on the liquid biopsies.
Yeah, I think liquid biopsies are certainly helping us serve our patients better. Biopsies certainly can be painful sometimes, and I'm sorry about that. I think we do have a lot of techniques that are improved to be able to give people local anesthesia and to give people sort of sedating medications to make it more comfortable. Certainly talking to your biopsy doctor, the interventional radiologist, about an experience you might have had in the past, so that they can do better by you this time and maybe give you more medication. But absolutely, liquid biopsies, what happens with tumors is they sometimes shed their DNA into the blood. And then with just a simple blood test, you can pick up that DNA and sequence that DNA the way we sequence biopsies. There's benefits and limitations, as there are with all tests, So one of the benefits is that it's not very invasive. There are a lot of companies now that will come to your home and actually do the blood test and send it off for you. Those panels are often, 70 genes, 90 genes, and sometimes the tissue-based profiles are like more than 300 genes sometimes. Although, the liquid biopsies usually capture the main 40 to 50 big cancer genes. There's certain alterations that are better caught in tissue than in blood. So for example, the fusions, FGFR2 fusions, they're only about 10% of the time do you catch it in blood, but otherwise mass majority of the time you are able to catch it in tissue. The other thing liquid biopsy is good for is that if you're on a particular drug and we're trying to see if you're developing resistance, instead of doing a biopsy every 2 months, we can do a blood sample every 2 months, and then we can see. It doesn't make sense for most drugs, like it doesn't make sense on chemotherapy to do that or some of the other treatments, but you can talk to your doctor about where liquid biopsy might make sense. But certainly someone who also had a biopsy, but there wasn't enough tissue, because that sometimes happens with cholangiocarcinoma, a liquid biopsy at least is a good first pass to see if there's anything that we're missing. And insurance companies are now increasingly, sorry, Melinda.
No, you're good. Go ahead.
I just want to say insurance companies are increasingly recognizing that liquid biopsies are an integral part of people's care. And so insurance companies are increasingly covering liquid biopsies as well.
Okay, that sounds good. we have about 10 minutes left. So if anyone has questions, please submit them in the Q&A box. But I'm just wondering, Lipika, if you could maybe just touch on, I guess, some of the trials that are out there that are looking promising, or, I don't know if you can just do an update, clinical trial update 101.
That's a great question. That's a little bit hard to say, only because with the clinical trials, we don't know what the data look like, right? They don't have the interim data to say what is more promising than something else. I can mention some of the trials that are out there, if that's helpful. So for the phase 3 trial, would that be helpful?
Yeah, I think so. And a couple other questions came in, but go ahead. I do think it would be helpful.
I think I mentioned some of the phase 3 trials. There's a series of gemcitabine cisplatin plus trials. So it's worth asking your oncologist if you're unfortunately have the new diagnosis and you're trying to search for things, definitely reach out to us, because there's different trials that you can think about. If you have a HER2 amplification or HER2 mutation, there's certain HER2 inhibitors. There's a whole bunch of them. I'm reticent to name one because there's like so many HER2 inhibitors that are out there. There are a series of FGFR inhibitors, IDH1 inhibitors. There's some BRAF trials that are going on for combination drugs. There's a whole slew of immunotherapy trials at the NIH, at other institutions. Yeah, there's a lot out there. There's definitely a lot out there.
And I am more than happy to help anyone. If you have questions, feel free to email me, and I'm happy to help do some searching. So here's a question. How often do mutations change? Are there new actionable mutations? And how does that occur? How often do you have to have retesting done?
Yeah, it's a good question. How often should I have a biopsy? How often should I have a liquid biopsy? We're learning more about tumor heterogeneity. We're learning more about tumor evolution. We have a lot more to go. I would say that every once in a rare while, you'll see something like someone was not MSI high and then they become MSI high. I've only seen that once in my life in one patient with cholangiocarcinoma, but on a rare occasion that could happen. On certain targeted therapies, like we talk about resistance, so with IDH inhibitors, with FGFR inhibitors, with BRAF inhibitors, HER2 inhibitors. With the targeted therapies, we talk about trying to understand what are the resistance mechanisms that are driving the tumor to grow. And if you can identify the resistance mechanism, this is still mostly in the research realm, but we're starting to figure out ways to use that data clinically. That if we can identify what mutation someone develops after they're on targeted therapy, that can help us choose plan B. So I would say for targeted therapies, it can sometimes be helpful to get serial liquid biopsies plus minus a tumor biopsy. And then for immunotherapy, there's a lot more work being done about why do people develop resistance to immunotherapy. And so there are a lot of trials that will have a biopsy at progression. But right now, we don't have information about if you get a biopsy after immunotherapy and you have progression, that'll definitely tell us what we should be doing next.
Okay, so along that line, is it true that if an immunotherapy clinical trial was not successful for you, that you are then ineligible for future immunotherapy trials? I think that all just depends on the inclusion-exclusion criteria as well.
Yeah, can you say that one more time? Sorry.
So if you entered into one immunotherapy trial and didn't have success, can you do another?
I hear that all the time. If I go on this drug, is it closing any doors for me? And the truth is that some trials do say if you've been on immunotherapy before, you can't go on this trial, but that should not prevent you from going on an immunotherapy trial. I know sometimes there's like, oh, what if I pick the wrong one? And what if that one's gonna work and not this one? But I think people are increasingly recognizing that after immunotherapy, people need more immunotherapy options. And so in the post-immunotherapy space, there are a lot more trials that are opening up. So yes, there are going to be some trials that you may not be eligible for. In the same way, if you're on a BRAF inhibitor trial, you may not be able to go onto a different BRAF inhibitor trial, for example. But still, we want everybody to pick what's available at that moment. Hopefully it's a good option. Talk to your oncologist about it, talk to your team about it. And then we go with that option, and then we see what other options are out there.
Okay, a couple more. Let's see, wanting to know, if a clinical trial for pemigatinib can be given to a CC patient with FGFR2 fusion after they have already received chemo with GEM-CIS. Does that make sense?
Yeah, if someone has an FGFR2 fusion, they got GEM-CIS first, that's exactly the population that pemigatinib is approved in.
Right. And they don't even need a clinical trial for that right now because it's
Correct.
approved.
Yeah, it's approved.
Yeah,
Yep.
as long as they have the mutation. Some of these questions I will try to answer on my own, or they're directed, and some of them are a little too medical, I guess. I'm going to try to go through these.
Try to figure out the generalizable ones that are applicable to a lot of people. Yeah.
And feel free to just jump in with anything else that we might not have covered.
Dr. Melinda, you have been on a clinical trial. I mean, anything that you can share from being on a clinical trial?
In my mind, I just think clinical trials are so important. And until we get better standard of care and treatments out there, to me, it's where we need to be to find, a better treatment, to buy us more time to get to the next best treatment. So I think clinical trials are just important and imperative. And I just really feel like as patients, we have not a whole lot to lose and a lot to gain. I mean, the risks are there, and that's a given, but I also feel the same way with the gemcitabine, cisplatin, and the chemos. It's one of those things, even with the chemos, we don't know if it's good. We don't know until we know. And that's just the way it is with all of it right now. So
one of the other questions that I think came up in the chat this morning that you sent me was that, when is the best time to time going on a clinical trial? And we were both saying like as soon as possible. I just want to echo that point that, the truth is sometimes clinical trial drugs don't work. And you want to be able to have a cushion that maybe the tumor grew over 6 weeks or grew over 8 weeks, but you're not in trouble. You're still like, you're in good shape. And okay, we lost 6 to 8 weeks because the drug didn't work, but now you're still in good shape to go on to the next thing. And so some people think, oh, after I've exhausted everything, I'll go on a clinical trial. But then sometimes some of the other treatments we give, they can affect your bone marrow, so they can affect your platelets or your white blood cells, or they can affect your liver function. And then because these trials have such strict criteria, sometimes it's hard to get into a clinical trial later on.
Right.
So I'm not saying you have to go into a clinical trial like as plan B or as plan C, but I would at least consider it, because when you're feeling really healthy and you can travel to go back and forth for appointments, and you can afford to maybe have a drug that doesn't work for a little while, that's when you have the most cushion. When you have more tumor in the body, that 6 to 8 week wait is a little bit more costly.
Yeah, and I always say chemo isn't going anywhere. That option is always there.
Exactly, so, I agree with that fully.
I think maybe we can take one more question. How do you know if a clinical trial is trustable? I think this question came up. If it's posted on clinicaltrials.gov, is there a vetted source?
Yeah, generally speaking, the trials that are on clinicaltrial.gov have gone through a vetting process, generally speaking, like they need to be approved by a variety of different groups, in order to be able to go on. It's often the pharmaceutical company, it's often the institutions are also, before they offer it to any patients, they are going to be approved by the ethical committee and the scientific committee of any institution. That's not for clinicaltrials.gov, but that's to be able to put drugs in a patient. In order for you to publish any clinical trial, it has to be registered on clinicaltrials.gov because it's that first screening process, So I wouldn't say that every single drug out there is a good trial, or every single trial out there is a good trial, because some drugs are more promising than others, but that's where your oncologist comes in and helps you make that decision. Never be shy about asking. That's what we're here for.
Right, exactly. So for all the other questions, Rick will get them to me and I will try to answer them or get them answered to the best of our ability, because we are out of time. Lipika, do we want to do the post-test poll real quick?
Yeah, let's do that.
All right, we'll do that real quick and then we will wrap it up. And for everybody, this is recorded, so we'll have access to it anytime you want. So go ahead and do the post-test again. Do you know the difference between phase 1, 2, 3 clinical trials? 2 is, do you know the difference between a cholangio-specific trial and a basket trial? And 3, would you join a phase 1 clinical trial? And 4, would you join a first-in-human study, a study where a drug is going into a human for the first time? We'll give you just a sec to finish those up, and we'll look at those results. And then once again, there will be a post-webinar survey, I think, emailed to all the registrants. If you guys would take that, we'd sure appreciate it. How's it looking, Rick?
Let's do 10 more seconds.
All right.
So.
And thank you, Lipika, so much for taking the time to answer all our questions and give us all the information. We are so appreciative of you.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for having me, Melinda.
Thank you.
It's you and all the people at the CCF that really do the tremendous work, all the patient advocates that work on this behalf. It's really, my thanks go to all of you for the ways that you help all of our patients get the information that they need. So thank you.
Well, we could do more, we would. Okay, so there we go. We got 94% now know the difference between phase 1, 2, and 3 trials. And 94% also know the difference between cholangio and basket trial. That's good. Phase 1, 66% would join a phase 1 clinical trial.
Okay, that was 31% before, so.
Yeah, glad to hear that.
Yeah.
And would you join a first-in-human study? 56% said yes.
Yeah.
Good, I think we made some improvements.
Yes, every drug, pemigatinib, the one that's FDA approved, that was once in a first-in-human study.
Exactly.
And my hat goes off to anyone who has the courage to join a clinical trial, because it does take courage. And yes, we are partners. We are partners in this path to help you. So reach out to us anytime.
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you, everyone. We appreciate you being here. Everyone, take care and have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.